An interesting article recently contrasted the history of the Ford Motor Company with that of General Motors. In the early days of the American car industry, Henry Ford's pioneering use of mass production and the assembly line meant that Ford pretty much had things his own way. For years, there was basically one kind of Ford car, the Model T, and it was available in one color, black. You may have heard the famous remark old Henry Ford is supposed to have made: the public can have any color Model T they want as long as it's black. Henry Ford had some great ideas about standardization and efficient production, but these same strengths revealed some vulnerabilities. Ford just wasn't very flexible. But as long as he didn't have to be, all was well and good. Then along came General Motors, which started offering cars in lots of different colors, and which even began bringing out new and different models every single year. Suddenly Ford, which had been making the rules, discovered that the rules had changed. The competition had changed the shape of the playing field. Ford's success had been attained by limiting options and minimizing complications, but now there was immediately a need for adaptability and change. Despite its early lead in the car industry, Ford was now forced to play catch-up. And it took nearly 70 years. That's what happens when rigidity and narrow thinking runs into flexibility and creative innovation. Sometimes in the late afternoon when the sun is setting and I look out at the flow of traffic on our great interstate highway system, with the television picking up the 5 o'clock news of the world via satellite and the telephone answering machine taking the calls, and supper cooking in the microwave oven, I like to reflect on how much the world has changed over the past 50 years. Microcomputers, supersonic passenger planes, men walking on the moon, Israel and Egypt at peace, the collapse of communism, fax machines, video conferencing, and these are just a few changes I've seen in my lifetime. My parents lived at the beginning of this century and had to witness far greater changes even than I have. They saw the United States go from 38 to 50 states, saw the horse and buggy replaced by the automobile, saw rail travel replaced by airplane travel, saw the candle and oil lamp give way to electricity in every home, and indoor plumbing, and the telephone, and radio, and television. It must have been like being born on one planet, and while completely wide awake and going about their daily business, being effortlessly transported by some friendly alien to an entirely different and strange world. They were born in an age of the telegraph and railroad and steamship, and they saw the birth of the atomic age. Instead of fearing wild Indians, they learned that the entire human race could be wiped out by a single finger pushing the wrong button. But perhaps I am not giving my parents enough credit. It's true they saw tremendous changes, and the world of 1950 compared to the world at the start of the 20th century must have looked like a science fiction dream of the future come true. But not the way anybody would have predicted. My parents not only lived with these tremendous changes, they managed to thrive with them. They brought electricity into their home and change into their lives. They grew with the times. They welcomed the new. They did not cling rigidly to the old ways, to the world they grew up with, but they were flexible and put down deep roots and flourished. They were not frightened or paralyzed by the terrible promise of the powers unlocked by atomic energy. They believed in the good as well as in the terrible. They knew human nature and the will to survive. They often told me when I was a little boy not to be frightened by all the big claims made by people in the world, because the human race was capable and adaptable, and the will to survive was stronger than the will of any man or the power of any machine. A strong character is not a rigid character. In fact, exactly the opposite is true. Although it's important to be firm when you know something is right and to maintain that right position even when the crowd is going against you and wants to put you down, it's also important for a person to remember that no person is God. Nobody is infallible or invincible. Sometimes when the tide has run against you for a long time, it may be that what you held as a certainty was in fact not true in the light of overwhelming circumstances. It's not only right, it's also smart to be able to see more than one way to accomplish a task. It's wise to see more than one solution to any problem. It's a good skill to see things as someone else might see them. Because when the plan that served you so well for so long doesn't work anymore, then it's time to find another way. It's time to bend. It's time to move on, to change, to compromise, to talk. Or you'll risk snapping like a dead branch in a stiff breeze. When it comes to lasting a long time, to standing tall and being strong, but knowing when to bend, the trees have a lot to teach us. I don't know if you have ever had first-hand experience of the tremendous destructive power of tropical force storms. I've experienced a hurricane and had a chance to witness close-up and personal what a combination of wind and water can do to everything that stands in its path. The rain fell so long and hard that it completely soaked the ground and loosened the roots of even the tallest trees. At the same time, the wind blew with such force that century-old trees, tall and hard and strong, were blown over like so many toy soldiers standing on parade knocked down by a toddler at play. However, the enormous willows, some standing tall as a house and covering what would be an entire lot in some parts of the city, lithe and flexible, and bending and bowing gracefully to the slightest breeze or to the mightiest gust, weathered the heavy blows of the storm. They were almost the only large objects left standing after the air had cleared. Not only were tall trees and power poles and seawalls crushed by the storm, houses built to stand up under normal circumstances collapsed and their roofs were carried off in one piece and blown clear into the next county. Everything that tried to oppose the storm's fury was damaged or destroyed. Everything that gave way, that was strong yet flexible, survived. Maybe some of you remember playing the game of scissors, stone, and paper when you were kids. You know, make a fist and count to 3. At 3, put out a flat hand, paper, 2 fingers, scissors, or keep the fist, stone. In the game, scissors cut paper, paper covers stone, and stone breaks scissors. Whoever put out the winning object got a point. The best strategy was not to stick to one thing. You had to try and guess what your opponent would offer, and turn your fist into the thing that would defeat your opponent's scissors, stone, or paper. This game teaches a child to think about the nature of materials, how something can be strong or appropriate in one situation, and yet be the wrong tool, a losing proposition in another. It also teaches a child to vary his approach, to be flexible, so that his opponent can't anticipate what he's going to do, and recognize that even as you are trying to outsmart the other guy is also trying to outsmart you. It remains to be seen how the great changes we are seeing right now in our own day, the laptop computer, and the rise of the internet, the prospect of scheduled flights on the space shuttle, and the falling away of international boundaries to trade, the rise of nations in the Pacific Rim, and the apparent decline of the old European powers, it remains to be seen how these changes will affect our own lives and the lives of our children. You see, the nature of change is such that these things which today look so large and important may turn out to be mere flashes in the historical pan. There may be something else we haven't even thought about. It could be something as obscure as a population explosion among virus-resistant rabbits in Australia. That will be the key element in global changes we can neither anticipate nor even imagine. This has often happened throughout history. That's a key point, of course. That's why all our best-laid plans do sometimes go astray. It's entirely possible and even likely that nothing will ever turn out as we expect. And so no matter how much we prepare for one turn of fate, something will sneak up from the blind side when we're least expecting to be interrupted at our accustomed rounds. When that time comes, as it will, the people who survive and even triumph over the unanticipated will be people who are ready to adapt. They will bend in the first gust. They will step out of the path of the charging bull. They will pivot while holding their place in the scheme of things. They will step back and let something else bear the brunt of impact. I don't really think it's less important or more important today to be open to change and flexible in adapting to it than it has been in the past. It's always been important to be flexible and far-sighted, anticipating whenever we can, and when we can't anticipate, being prepared for all possibilities. The United States has been in existence for over 200 years. Think of all the things that have happened in that time, the immense technological and social changes that have taken place. The Founding Fathers deliberately left the Constitution a bit vague in some areas so that future generations would have the flexibility to adapt it to changing circumstances. And that's exactly what happened, and it's worked for more than 200 years. But now let's look back in time for a moment. The Roman Empire endured for about 500 years, more than twice the time the United States has existed. The framers of the Constitution closely studied the decline and fall of Rome in order to create an American government that would avoid a similar fate. So far, their efforts certainly seem successful, but it will be another few hundred years before we're really able to say we've lasted longer than Rome did. And despite all the remarkable flexibility our form of government has displayed over the past 2 centuries, it's almost inconceivable that we'll ever last as long as the ancient Egyptian empire that spanned more than 2,000 years. Think of it. That's 10 times as long as America has existed. Famines, floods, invasions, and plagues came and went. But through it all, there was an unbroken succession of Egyptian pharaohs. Nothing lasts that long, certainly not a government, without a great deal of flexibility. Yet amazingly enough, when it comes to flexibility and being able to adapt to the changing circumstances of history, Egypt isn't even the all-time champion. The oldest and longest-lasting empire in the world is that of the Chinese. Many dynasties, many emperors, many reigns, but always the empire endured. How was this possible? It wasn't because of military power or tremendous wealth, because over the course of thousands of years, those things came and went many times. The real reason the Chinese empire lasted so long was because of the work of 2 very different philosophers. The first, Confucius, provided ideas that became the solid foundation of the imperial government. He supplied the theories by which the imperial government was conducted. Confucius taught a code of ethics that provided specific instruction on how the ruling classes could fulfill their duty to the nation and maintain law and order. He was essentially a lawgiver, a thinker who supplied some fixed beacons for navigating the ship of state into the unknown future. The second philosopher, whose name was Lao Tse, had a very different perspective. Historians associate Lao Tse's ideas with magic and with mystical powers. But he also placed a very modern kind of emphasis on the need for intuition and the ability to react quickly to change. Lao Tse pointed out that sometimes it is best to advance by retreating, that sometimes wars can be won by losing a few battles, and long-term goals can be achieved by accepting short-term reversals. Sometimes it is best to resist like the tall grasses bending in the wind, or like a river finding a new route around an obstacle. A powerful ocean wave smashing onto a beach may wash away a sand dune, but the individual grain of sand simply goes with the flow and is unharmed. By incorporating both these perspectives, the ancient Chinese emperor developed a structure similar to that of modern buildings in Los Angeles and Tokyo that are built to withstand earthquakes. Their foundations are strongly reinforced, but there's also room for sway and give. Flexibility is simple in theory, but tremendously challenging in practice. It means we have to learn to distinguish between what we can control and what is beyond our control. Practicing flexibility requires great self-knowledge and iron self-control, like a master of the Oriental martial arts. To be flexible does not mean to be weak, to flounder about aimlessly and confused because we think there's nothing to be done. No, it requires self-discipline. Flexibility requires a cool head, an appraising eye, poise, balance, and judgment. Think of the bullfighter in the arena, in front of a roaring, waving crowd, fired by excitement and waiting for the kill. He knows they don't care who is killed, him or the bull. What they want is blood. He knows the bull is powerful, more powerful than he is, but the bull also always charges in a straight line, while he can step aside. And the bull has his eye on the cape and cannot see the sword concealed there. And the bull is enraged, while the fighter is cool and skilled and willing to try all the steps in the dance of death. His only enemy, really, is himself. If he fears the noise of the crowd or the bull's hot breath, or thinks that there's only one way to end the afternoon, then the bullfighter, and not the bull, is the doomed one. But if he controls his nerves and knows when to stand firm and when to retreat, then the ear and the tail, and the cries of the crowd, and the love of the beautiful women will be for him. There's really very little difference between the graceful passes the bullfighter makes with the bull and the fluid motions of a martial arts master who's defending himself against an aggressor. In both cases, the strength and the aggression of the opponent is made to work for the defender. It's like opening a door just as the battering ram is about to break it down, so that forward velocity carries the invaders through the gate, past the mark, and on to destruction. Little children often play a similar game when in a match of tug-of-war. One side suddenly lets go of the rope, and the opposing side falls down. Up to now, we've mostly talked about what might be called tactical flexibility, where a specific situation requires a knowledge of the various alternatives, and a specific set of circumstances requires nimbleness and dexterity. More difficult and more important is the inner flexibility and long-range adaptability that are called for from the person who wants not just to survive, but succeed. A very wise man once said, "You can't step in the same river twice. Every moment all things are changing, and the next minute is never like the last one. Whenever you achieve a hard-won success, it's always because you've been able to create a flexible response to the conflicting needs and ambitions and feelings of other people. You've been able to sidestep the accidents of fate, and the quirks of nature, and the innate tendency we all have to depend on yesterday's solutions to solve today's problems. I spoke earlier of how the Founding Fathers relied on the example of Rome as they constructed the framework of American democracy. It's interesting to observe that at one of the times of greatest luxury and power and perhaps complacency ever in the history of the world, the heyday of the Roman Empire, a philosophy arose that attempted to teach these men who ruled the known world how to govern themselves. These philosophers, who called themselves Stoics, taught that in order simply to survive in life, let alone be a leader, you must learn to take responsibility for the way things affect you. At the same time, you must learn to bend with the wind of forces too great for your control. This kind of self-measurement and self-control should be part of every grown-up's character. After all, an adult is the leader of his own family, of his children, who grow up in part learning from his example. To be firm but fair, to be clear and consistent but flexible, is to possess maturity. Kids are delightful, but sometimes they are the most inflexible people on earth. Since circumstances almost never turn out exactly the way they want them to, they are on a constant roller coaster ride in terms of their responses, up 1 minute, down the next. One young lady, a little girl of 5 actually, will only eat her cornflakes in a certain way. If you don't pour exactly 1/2 cup of whole milk straight from the refrigerator into the bottom of the cereal bowl, and then add the cornflakes so that they float on top of the milk, and then sprinkle a teaspoon of white sugar over that, she won't eat breakfast at all. Not anything. She could be hungry and cranky and weak, but she will purse her lips together and shake her head so hard that her braids whip her cheeks, and she will not eat. In other ways, however, because they haven't formed opinions about a lot of things and lack the experience which can trick people into anticipating an outcome, kids can be far more adaptable than grown-ups. They can accept poverty or harsh living conditions or sudden reverses in fortune, because for children, all things look equally inevitable and have always been there. Children have softer bones and dispositions than older people, so they're more apt to receive new impressions instead of repelling or opposing them. This is, like all our traits and gifts, both a blessing and a curse. Old people can get set in their ways, can get mentally as well as physically brittle. They can tell themselves that they know it all already, have seen it all before, and instead of struggling against the hardening of the arteries and the ossification of ideas, they can become as stubborn and willful as children who don't know anything, and with often the same harmful results. When I think about an old person who has managed to adapt to life's changes, big and small, and stay ahead and keep in step, I think about that grand old vaudevillian and cigar-smoking joker and singer, admirer of beautiful women, George Burns. George Burns started out in show business before the days of talkie pictures, touring the vaudeville stage circuit with his wife and comedy partner Gracie Allen. Together, they joked their way from the stage to the movies and to the radio. Later, when television came along, the George Burns and Gracie Allen show was one of the great ones, running every week for years and years. Until one day, Gracie Allen died, leaving George Burns alone in the world with only his cigar, a trunk full of gag lines, a few $1 million in the bank, and a lot of great memories. Did Burns retire after his wife's death? Did he crawl off and play golf until the Grim Reaper came for him? No. Burns wrote himself a new act, a new set of monologues. He made a new career in the movies and basically reinvented himself. He continued to crack jokes and pursue lucrative movie and television roles and personal appearances. He made a career out of being old, and he didn't do that by being inflexible, you can bet. I think it was a great American novelist and keen observer of his fellow man who remarked that old people are on the same side of life as children and animals, and that they can see things regular people do not. Well, old people and children as well as animals can get so set in their ways that nothing, not even the survival instinct, will change them. I mentioned earlier about the little girl who would only eat a certain way. Well, old people too often get fussy about their food. They also get particular about what people talk about in front of them, and who performs those little services that old people and babies often require, like feeding, and sometimes even changing diapers. It's uncomfortable to think about our bodies turning on us this way, but it doesn't do to be rigid and say that we'll never get old and set our minds into some hardened position so that we cannot accept help when it's needed and offered. That would be the kind of pride that destroys a person just as surely as walking into speeding traffic saying to yourself, the pedestrian has the right of way. True, but tell that to the ambulance attendant. Flexibility and compromise are at the center of democracy and the American way of life. In private life, there are places where you can be unyielding if you want to be, and only you will profit or suffer because of your firmness. In the national arena of politics, however, with so many different groups holding so many different and often uncompromising positions, the only way for government to work is to declare all things are negotiable and talk everything out to find some path acceptable to all parties, if not satisfactory to any of them. That's why our forefathers, when they drew up the Constitution of the United States, made religion and government completely separate. You can't compromise in matters of religion, and you'd be a hypocrite or worse if you did. So the Founding Fathers set all those things where people really can't be expected to compromise off to the side, for other theaters than political theater, for other contests than contests of public policy. There was an American statesman, Henry Clay of Kentucky, who was known as the Great Pacifier and the Great Compromiser. Clay served in the United States Senate, in Congress, and was Secretary of State under President John Quincy Adams. Clay both incited the War of 1812 and helped negotiate the Treaty of Ghent that settled the war. Pursuing a consistent policy of reconciling the conflicting interests of the nation during the time of the great westward expansion, he ramrodded the Missouri Compromise and helped enact the National Road. As a presidential candidate, Clay said that he would rather be right than be president, and he certainly never did become president. Whether or not he was right, I couldn't say, but I suppose he felt that he was right, and that right meant finding a common path to an agreed-upon end. A wise and flexible old gentleman used to dine every month in his club downtown, sitting at a long table covered with a white linen tablecloth and silver candlesticks, and served by tuxedoed waiters, loved to regale companions with the fruits of his many years of experience. After dessert and coffee were served, he would push back from the table and light an enormous imported cigar. "This cigar is the only indulgence of an old man," he would say with a chuckle, as he struck the wooden match against his thumbnail, and then he'd launch into one of his stories. They usually began with a question, such as, "Did I ever tell you about the time when I was setting up factories for the giant XYZ Corporation in the backwoods of Georgia and was compelled to teach them a little lesson in business and good manners?" Although the stories always started out the same, no two stories were ever alike, and there would always be a wealth of wisdom through example, a veritable mother lode of remarkable instruction. Well, this old man who was so old and so wise and so flexible has one ironclad rule for dealing with other people. This rule involved never being the first to break a bargain and always assuming that what happened before should not happen again. He said, "If a man fools me once, I think, that's not nice, and I remember it. And if the same man fools me a second time, I think, shame on you. If the same fellow tricks me a third time, well, I have been warned, and should have changed my ways and didn't, and I think, shame on me." Here's a little rhyme to remind you of this wisdom. Fool me one, that's not nice. Fool me two, shame on you. Fool me three, shame on me. If you're not changing your responses to the situations and circumstances that make up your life, you're not being flexible, and you're throwing away your greatest asset as an individual human being. None of us can completely control external events, but we can always control and adapt our responses. None of us can know which cards fate is going to deal out, but we can always control how we play them.